Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name's Ben Wray. I'm a journalist and I coordinate the Gig Economy Project, Brave New Europe's media network for gig workers in Europe. I'm delighted to be joined by Costas Lapavitsas. If you don't know, Costas is a professor of economics at SOAS in London. He's the author of numerous books, including Profiting Without Producing, and most recently, The State of Capitalism, which was published in December and co-written with the EReNSEP Writing Collective. And I've read that book. It's a fantastic read. I'd thoroughly recommend it. Costas is also a former member of the Greek Parliament, and he's a candidate in the upcoming European Parliament elections for a coalition between DiEM25 and the ecological radical left in Greece. Now, before we get into this interview, this discussion about the EU's economy, just got a bit of information for you. First of all, this event is part of a series of online events that Brave New Europe is doing alongside the Scottish anti-capitalist website Conter, called the State of the Union. The first event took place last Thursday with Wolfgang Streeck, and you can watch that on our YouTube channel or on the Brave New Europe website. The next and final event after this one tonight is going to be with Tara McCormack on the militarisation of the EU, and that will be on the 16th of May at 7 p.m. CET time. In terms of tonight's event, if you want to put a question to Costas, you can put it in the YouTube chat box or a comment on the Twitter if you're watching it on Twitter, and I'll try my best to fit in as many of the questions as I can. And finally, if you're not aware of Brave New Europe, then I'd recommend that you follow us on the Twitter, subscribe to the YouTube channel, and get all our latest news and information that we publish on Europe's economy and politics, which is what we're going to get in tonight. Now, Costas, I want to start by getting your analysis of the condition of the Eurozone today. You've argued for a long time that the Euro, rather than bringing Europe together, has led to a kind of economic divergence within Europe, with a core based around especially Germany and a periphery, especially Southern Europe, also Central and Eastern Europe. And that's, the Euro is pulling these parts of Europe apart in terms of inequality and that sort of thing. Some commentators have argued that everything is now changing with the current context of the inflation crisis. There was an article in the New York Times last week called Europe's Economic Laggards Have Become Its Leaders. And in that piece, it argues that Europe is actually rebalancing because of the energy price rises, where Greece, Spain and Portugal have grown twice as fast over 2023 as Germany, which has barely avoided a recession. Is there any truth in that? Have the tables turned in Europe? Is the Eurozone rebalancing, or is the critique that you've held for a long time, does that still stand?
I saw that article myself in the New York Times. I read it a few days ago. And you'll be pleased to know that he has been reproduced in the Greek press, the main right-wing newspaper supporting the government, because obviously it's music to the government's ears. And when I read it, and I came across similar opinions by various economists working for essentially financial market outfits, I was astounded by the level of journalism and the level of what passes for journalism and the level of analysis by what passes for economic analysis, analysts and analysis. It's just astonishing where we've come. I mean, the simple maths and the simple statement that if Greece is the locomotive of Europe, that says a lot more about Europe than it does about Greece. Purely in terms of the numbers, here we're talking 2% growth. Just to be clear, that's the rate of growth in Greece, the record breaker, 2.1 or so, something to that effect. I mean, that's what we're talking about. And Germany teetering over recession indeed, and Portugal a little bit less than Greece, and Spain a little bit less than Greece too. So that's really the dynamic growth that we're talking about, not even 2%. And actually, that's on the down. If you look at what the rate of growth is doing in all these three countries, it's actually declining. So the rate this year will be less than that. So no, the short answer is no, there is no rebalancing worth talking about. What there is a serious crisis that has hit Germany, which we can no doubt discuss, and a crisis that has hit the Eurozone and the European Union as a whole. In that context, it is true, the southern periphery is doing relatively better than the core. It's not rebalancing, it's not changing the order of things, it's just doing relatively better than the core because the core has been badly exposed and because of particular reasons for the periphery, which I'm happy to discuss. They're quite similar in all these three countries, Greece, Portugal, and Spain. So the short answer is no. Europe is very much split in core and periphery. The southern periphery is not going anywhere and is not making good the gap anytime soon.
Well, I was going to ask you about Greek, Greek society, Greek economy, because yes, part of that New York Times article, it said that the country had been transformed by cutting red tape, cutting corporate taxes, investments from multinationals like Microsoft and Pfizer, and record tourism. But what you're saying is essentially that the country is still suffering the same problems it was 10 years ago when austerity was at its peak, right?
I mean, again, one reads these articles and doesn't know, who qualifies as a journalist for the New York Times these days. But if you look at the Greek economy as that has been transformed or whatever, restructured as a result of the bailouts that the country went through in the previous decades, what's the most remarkable thing is that 10 years on, the economy of Greece looks very much like the economy that led it to the crisis in the first place. Far from it being restructured, it looks very, very similar. And it's not that surprising if you think about that. See, the main pivot of restructuring, the thing that presumably would put Greece on a different growth path according to the IMF and the European Union, the Commission and so on, was low wages. The answer was low wages. Push wages down. That's basically what it was. That was the motor that would presumably improve competitiveness and drive Greece forward. And low wages have prevailed. Yeah. Greek people, Greek workers, and others who rely on wages and a whole range of incomes that are connected to wages have been hammered. Greece has got the second lowest disposable income in the European Union. That wasn't mentioned by the New York Times because it doesn't fit the description. So the second lowest disposable income in the European Union, second only to Bulgaria. And Bulgaria is on the up, whereas Greece is on the down still. So the solution for Greece, presumably, was low wages. And they did it. They've squeezed labor. The exploitation is phenomenal. The Greek labor market is the Wild West as far as labor rights are concerned and the way employers treat workers. And that was it. In terms of investment, the country has got an appalling record, absolutely appalling record. There's been no investment worth talking about. Investment is currently at 14% of GDP, way below the 22% of the European Union, which is already low itself. That's a low percentage. Turkey, for instance, which is next to Greece, and it is indeed a rising economy, has got 30% of GDP investment. Greece has got 14%. Greek private capital doesn't invest. So they make profits through the inflation mechanism that I've already mentioned here. You raise prices, you manipulate the prices because you've got oligopolistic conditions and oligarchy positions in various markets. You squeeze wages, and then there's an income shift away from wages towards business profits. That's what's happened. You don't invest. That's what Greek capitalists do. So no investment, squeeze wages, productivity growth in Greece is zero. Labor is just not stagnant, utterly, and of course, no investment, no productivity growth. That's how you get productivity growth. You don't get it. It's not mystery, right? It's no magic. So the country doesn't invest. There's no productivity growth, and it squeezes labor in order to generate profits. I mean, I don't really need to say more to indicate the complete dead end into which Greek capitalism and the foreign lenders have led the country. But I can say more, because as they did this, the structure of the economy that they created it's breathtaking. It's very similar to the one that took us to the abyss. The vast bulk of GDP is services of low competitiveness and low productivity. The dominant one is tourism, 25% of GDP. So an economy the size of Greece isn't a very small economy, right? It's a mid-ranking economy. 25% of GDP is astonishing. Tourism is not a good sector to over-rely on because it doesn't create synergies. It doesn't create further productivity gains. But it creates bad jobs. So that's what's happened. So tourism and services are the bulk of the Greek economy. Industry is less than 10%. And agriculture is 4 to 5%. That's it. That's Greek capitalism. Clearly, the long-term growth prospects of this capitalist formation are at less than 1% a year. That's what we're talking about. So 15 years after the crisis hit Greece back in 2009, 15 years after that, Greece hasn't made good the losses yet. Greek per capita income is 20% lower than that. That's the Greek success. And at 2% growth, which is what the New York Times was trumpeting, it will take a very long time to make good the losses. You understand? That's what we're talking about. So it's a disaster. It's a disaster for the Greek people as a whole. However, and that's why we've got to be careful because the politics is directly affected by that. However, not everybody has lost, which is how capitalism works, right? The majority of people have lost. The majority of people in Greece are on a very low disposable income. It's become a poor country, basically, right? People running to stay on the same spot, right? However, the top layer, the oligarchs that control the Greek economy, and we're talking some right crooks at times, right, have become more powerful. And they're doing it right. Profitability has increased, as I mentioned to you before, by squeezing labor and taking advantage of inflation. As well as that, there is a layer of the upper middle class, which is also not doing too badly, extracting high salaries and rents, different types of rents. The rents come to a large extent from real estate and other such activities. Real estate is going through a bubble in Greece right now, amidst all this general economic difficulty. It's going through a bubble in Greece now, not because of bank lending. The banks are not lending. Banks and it's not credit that's doing it. It's foreign direct investment, which has increased. And contrary to the New York Times article, the vast bulk of foreign direct investment is going to real estate. So in 2022, Greece received $7 billion foreign direct investment. In 2023, $5 billion, significant amounts to Greece. The bulk of that, 4/5 of that, didn't go to productive activities. They went to real estate and various financial activities. The middle class draws rents out of that. And that's also associated with tourism, Airbnb, and so on. You've got a little bit of money on one side, you do your flat up, you put it in the market, you make a rent through tourism and Airbnb. That layer is done okay. And that is the backbone of support for the right at the moment.
Mm. We're going to get back into the politics of it near the end when we talk about your election campaign. I want to zoom out a little bit again and look at the kind of the economic management of the Eurozone today, because during the pandemic, the fiscal rules were junked, and the next generation EU funds were created, which for the first time established a kind of some sort of common public investment instrument in the Eurozone. Just a couple of weeks ago, the new fiscal rules have been introduced, which are slightly more nuanced than the old ones, but are basically, my reading is, they're basically along the similar lines. Where do you see the EU going? Is it still going to remain a kind of monetary policy heavy Eurozone, or do you see a kind of fiscal element being developed to the Eurozone going forward?
It would be very difficult for the Eurozone to go back to the mindless austerity of the previous decade. It'd be very difficult to do that. In the previous decade, the 2010s, Europe and the Eurozone recorded the worst performance of all the major capitalist concentrations in the world market. The worst performance. There was practically no growth at all. And one fundamental reason was the pursuit of austerity, right? And rigid austerity embedded in the institutional makeup of the Union. Incidentally, the other country that did similarly stupid thing was Britain, right? Which followed a very strongly restrictive policy because of what the Tories wanted to do. But anyway, that's a different story. So Europe followed that kind of path, austerity, severe austerity when it comes to fiscal policy, and paid the price. The South paid the price most heavily, but everybody, working class and so on of Europe, paid the price. When the pandemic hit, as you rightly say, the situation became so critical, especially for the Eurozone, so quickly, especially Italy. Italy came within an ace of having a major crisis, that the powers that be in the European Union realized that they had to lift fiscal rules, fiscal austerity, and they had to lift monetary austerity as well. And they did. It became very clear that austerity is a choice. And it became very clear that tight monetary policy is a choice. It's not a necessity. But obviously, inflation followed. So the lifting of austerity and the loosening of monetary rules made abundantly clear the weakness of the supply side in Europe, the weakness of the production side. Inflation went through the roof, so they had to reverse course in monetary policy. They raised interest rates and severely, and gradually they began to tighten austerity policy, fiscal policy, to return to austerity. It's nothing as nearly as severe as in the 2010s yet, though. All countries that we're talking about, the South, Germany, and so on, have been squeezing the budget. You can see it. In the 2023, there's been a severe squeeze applied to budgets, including in Greece and so on. And the effects are obvious. Growth rates have contracted because the biggest element of growth, factor of growth in Europe was, of course, lifting fiscal austerity. So you can see immediately the results. Great growth rates have begun to fall, and they will fall further in 2024, including in the locomotive of the South. Will we go back to the same levels of austerity as in the 2010s, however? I don't think so. I will find it. Anybody who's got two brain cells to rub together realizes if that's what they do, I mean, the powers that be, if that's what they do, they're going to face a dramatically deteriorating social and political condition in Europe. I think they've got enough nous not to do that. So I expect we see a reversal of the loosening policy, including the fiscal realm. I don't think we're going to go back to the inanities of the previous decade. But your question was deeper than that. You are asking me, are we witnessing a structural change, that's how I understood, institutional change towards greater homogeneity and a sort of joint fiscal policy? I see no evidence of that. For such a thing to happen, you need political initiative, political drive.
So one of the things that European leaders are talking about spending money on is defence, right? There's even talks about creating a specific sort of fiscal instrument where they can spend on defence separate from their, their normal government budgets. Some people are talking about a sort of move towards what's called military neoliberalism in Europe, where you have the sort of tech defence companies in countries like in Spain, for example, Telefonica is a big one, which are very closely connected to national governments and are kind of directing the defence budgets of national governments and feeding off the defence budgets of national governments. Is that something that you see? And put it in a wider context as well, where do you see Europe in terms of the current conflicts in the world today and the sort of development of imperialism in the world today? Where does Europe sit within that wider context?
There is no doubt at all that military expenditure in Europe has been increasing in a sustained way, not since the war in Ukraine, long before that. You can see an upward trend of military expenditure in Spain, in Germany, and elsewhere from the end of the previous decade. 2017, 2018, 2019, it begins to go up. Germany in particular. Germany, the plans are for serious militarization, pushing towards 100 billion a year. That's a lot of money to spend on guns. Germany already spends a significant amount of money compared to 4 or 5 years ago. So there's no question that there is a advancing militarization of the major economies, which is a very important and dangerous development. Several industries will benefit from it. Quite how it's going to pan out, I'm not entirely certain yet, because militarily Europe is nowhere, right? There's a military power, it's nowhere. Despite the aggressive posture of many European leaders, including the British, incidentally, who are not members of the EU and are the most aggressive of the lot, but they're of Europe in this sense. Militarily, they're nowhere. The old joke about the British Army that you can put it in Wembley and you'll have seats to spare right now, right? So it's not as if they're a major power. However, militarism is a different thing. The governments have become very aggressive and warlike, and the warlike rhetoric is remarkable. And that has implications both at the world level and domestically in terms of the political life and social life of these countries. Now, can Europe restructure its economies, give itself a kind of Keynesian military boost, a kind of military neoliberalism, and therefore reposition itself on a world scale, and reappear as a major military power capable of competing against the United States, or together with the United States against Russia and against China? Can that happen? Well, obviously it can, but it's not likely. It's not likely at all. Europe has lost a lot of industrial capacity. It hasn't got the industrial capacity required to produce the weaponry necessary for modern war. Modern war isn't just advanced technology material. It's also, as we know, ammunition, artillery, tanks. This is heavy industrial output. It hasn't got the capacity for that. Only Germany has got the capacity, potentially, for it. But Germany lacks the electronic and other capacity in this regard. It hasn't got it. Germany is a laggard when it comes to microchips and so on. So the combination of loss of industrial capacity in heavy goods and heavy engineering and advanced electronics doesn't bode well for Europe being able to develop the military capability that would allow it to position itself independently if it wished to do so, and if it were politically capable, able to do so. So I don't think that this is going to be a world-shattering event. It will, however, have serious implications for political and economic interaction and life in Europe. It's a terrible development. And it's an indictment of the political and social evolution of Europe the last 2 decades. The European Union was supposed to be a force of peace, and it was supposed to project different type of power. And it was supposed to be a beacon of democracy, and it was supposed to be an example to the rest of the world. This guy Borrell, who postures as the foreign minister of European Union, heaven help us, even likened Europe to a garden and the rest of the world to a jungle. He said that he didn't have any shame, and he said that a few months ago. Well, the garden doesn't look very welcoming at the moment. And the way it's militarizing makes it even less welcoming, particularly because it's not going to have the result that they think it might have. So altogether, I think it says more about the decrepit state of European capitalism than anything realistic about how Europe will position itself in the world in the coming years. It's just, I just don't see it happening. Who is going to do it? Britain, Germany, France? How? What with? Where would the armies come from? I just don't see it.
Xi Jinping, president of China, he's in Europe, he's meeting Macron, Ursula von der Leyen. How do you see the China relationship to the Western world developing, and where do you see China's economies going? In the Western world, Ursula von der Leyen, the Federal Reserve, head of the Federal Reserve, they're talking about Chinese overcapacity and the problem of China producing too much cheap electric vehicles, too much cheap solar panels. Is that really a problem? How do you see it?
Yeah, the problem of overcapacity in China, which has been all over the media because the powers that be are pushing it, shows the absurdity of neoliberal policies. On the one hand, we're pushing for a green transition, which means electric cars and means energy from the sun. And on the other, we're complaining that China makes too many of these things. No, there aren't enough electric cars in the world. We need more. So there is no absolute overcapacity of such cars in China. What there is a Chinese car industry that has been dramatically restructured the last little while. It has got incredible competitive power at the moment, and it can drive most of European car business and US car business out of operation. That's basically what it is. And in the time-honored fashion of capitalist powers, they're complaining that this is unfair. I mean, when they do it themselves, it's perfectly fine. When other people do it to them, it's unfair. So that's what we've got. I expect that at some point they will impose some kind of controls, but they will still have the problem of justifying that in the eyes of their own people, us, because they keep insisting that we need electric cars. Well, if the Chinese can make them more cheaply, then make your mind up. Are you a neoliberal? Are you in favor of free markets? Or you know? I'm not in favor of that myself, right? I'm in favor of controlling trade. I'm in favor of controlling production. I'm in favor of managing it and rationally organizing it, but I'm not a neoliberal. So there you can see the absurdity of neoliberalism. But beyond that, what is amazing about what's happening at the moment is the political influence of China, and that's worth considering in more depth. We've got the science of historic European imperialism asking China to intervene to settle a war that's taking place on European soil in Ukraine. Put on the table the very important issue of how to restructure the Chinese economy. And that's not an easy thing for the Chinese Communist Party and the echelons of power in China, because shifting the economy away from vast investment, 50%, 45% of GDP is investment in China, shifting the economy away from that towards consumption, allowing the Chinese people to enjoy more of the fruits of their own labor, also entails social transformation. It will put in doubt the delicate balance of income distribution in China, which is unfair as it stands, but it will put it in doubt, and that is a political risk. And the Communist Party of China doesn't know what to do about it. So China faces first and foremost domestic problems of its economy, and he has to solve those. And the solution is not obvious. More broadly, however, it certainly is the second economic superpower now, not the second military power, that's Russia, but it's fast rising as a military power too, China is. And it will contest hegemony, that's what it's doing. And it has shown itself capable of major political intervention in the Middle East, for instance, where it managed to bring Iran and Saudi Arabia together to overcome the problems that the Americans have been creating for such a long time, and to create the prospect of some kind of peace, as long as the Israelis don't create a war, a major war over there. But China has demonstrated its capacity to do that, and it will intervene politically in Europe too. This is the transformation of the world. This is the decline of Europe politically. Europe is important to China. It's important as a market, primarily. Even Germany runs a significant trade deficit with China now. And China will cultivate Europe. It needs it. It needs it for the goods it produces. May I stress that exports are not as important in the Chinese economy as many people think. They're important, but they're not what drives the Chinese economy at the moment. So Europe is important. China wants to maintain good relations, and it will exercise power, and it will exercise influence, and that's how the world's going to be. And that's yet another indication of the relative demise of the European Union as a world player at the moment.
We've not really discussed yet the financial system and financialization, which was what I would consider your specialist area. You know, the books you've written, like Profit Without Producing. There's not really in the news at the moment, the financial system. But if you think about it, it was just, I think it was March last year when Credit Suisse, the Swiss bank, collapsed and had to be bought by its Swiss. I've forgotten the name of it. The Swiss bank which bought it, but it was bought out by the other big Swiss bank, and Silicon Valley Bank and a few US banks went down. Is the financial system stable? Are we heading to another financial crisis? Where are things going there?
No, I don't think we're heading towards another financial crisis at the moment. We escaped by the skin of our teeth in 2020 from another financial crisis. It wouldn't have been of the same scale as 2008, but it would have been pretty serious in 2020. We escaped by the skin of our teeth. That was another dimension of the pandemic, right? The major central banks intervened and created a lot of liquidity to allow the financial system to get out of it. What people have got to appreciate about financialization is this. The high point of financialization was the crisis of 2007, 2009, 2008, when nearly a large proportion of the global financial system in the North nearly went bankrupt. That was the high point. Since then, we certainly live in financialized capitalism. Finance is certainly very, very important, but it hasn't got the same dynamism and expansive drive as it had until then. It's very clear. What has allowed it to survive as financial activity and financialized capitalism is phenomenal intervention by the state. The intervention by the state in finance since 2008, since that crisis, is without precedent. And the main lever of that is the central bank. The European Central Bank, the Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, the Bank of Japan, as central banks pivotal to their own respective financial systems, and the Federal Reserve pivotal to the global financial system, are more important than at any other time in the history of capitalist finance. The main foundation of contemporary private finance is public finance, the central banks. And what allows that to happen is, of course, enormous creation of publicly backed money. A lot of people talk about the importance of private credit money, right? MMT people talk all the time about how important the money created by the private banks is, right? How big it is, and how it's used by capitalists and so on. Actually, in the last 15 years, it's not privately created credit money that is the most important thing, but publicly created credit money. Central bank money has been created without precedent. And that has allowed central banks to become the vast institutions that they are. They sit right in the middle of the financial system. With balance sheets that are gigantic, they dominate key financial markets. The central bank is always the most important player in the money market, which is the main market of the financial system. Right now, it's unthinkable that money markets would work without active intervention and active policy and active transacting by the central bank. That's what allows financialization to continue. The counterpart of that is, of course, vast accumulation of public debt. The central bank issues public fiat money, floods the world with it, dollars, euros, British pounds, yen, and so on. And as it does, to do that, it acquires public debt. The state borrows. So the state intervenes in the economy, supports demand, fiscally expands. The central bank buys some of that, creates money, and floods the world with publicly backed money. That allows financialization to continue, that allows banks to do business, and that allows hedge funds, investment funds, and all that vast fauna flora of the shadow banking system to make profits. So that's the kind of financialization that we've got at the moment. It speculates, it's active, but it hasn't got the drive that it had 15 years ago. It's on life support. It's on permanent life support. If central bank intervention ceases to be what it is, if they cease to create money the way they're doing, if they retreat from that, to a certain extent they did, in order to restrain inflation, then problems immediately appear. And if they were to go back to what the situation was in 2008, which is unthinkable, then there'll be no financialization, I can tell you. We've got state-based financialization at the moment. It's unthinkable they would continue without the state. So there's another paradox of neoliberalism for you. The more it talks about the dominance of the markets, the more it talks about the weakness of the state, the more it relies on the state. And I don't just mean on the state as the imposer of conditions and authoritarianism and so on. I mean it economically. It needs the state. It just doesn't work otherwise. It's not the natural system, in other words. Someone has to make it work, and that's the state, basically. And the biggest lever in the West is money creation. The ability to control money and to create it when capitalism needs it.
And that's expressed really well in the book. The State of Capitalism. I really recommend it for people who are interested in knowing more about that. I'm going to finish on two questions about politics, and one about your election campaign. But before I get onto that, I want to ask you about the relationship between European politics and the economy in Europe today. I mean, no one really believes that these European Parliament elections are going to have a decisive impact on Europe's economy, right? But at a deeper level, there seems to be a real disconnect between citizens and the economic decisions that are being taken by governments. the Irish political scientist Peter Mayer talked about the void, the void between citizens and their governments. And now governments attain their legitimacy not through representation of citizens, but through relationships with other member states within the European Union. That was his kind of analysis of where democracy's gone in Europe today. How do you see that? Do you think that we really live in a democracy today, in the sense that that your vote can actually affect the nature of the economy in Europe today, or is it really an oligarchic system that we have in Europe today?
We have formal democracy, and everybody talks about it. But democracy isn't just the ability to vote every 4 years or so. Democracy must have real content in terms of democratic rights. Democracy must mean democratic rights at work, in the neighborhood, in the town, the village, the city, the country. That can only happen when there are institutions and collective formations that allow the opinion of citizens to carry weight and to be translated into policy, to have an effect on policy. It is precisely this that doesn't exist today. It is precisely this that neoliberalism has finished off. These collective entities, these institutions that, to a certain extent in the past, allowed for that, it was never perfect, of course. You must never say that it was perfect, don't exist anymore. And the biggest weakness is trade unions. Trade unions were the biggest, most important lever for that, to project democratic rights and to protect democratic rights. So what we've got is, I wouldn't go take up or anything, I would call it a hollowing out of democracy. It retains the form, but it hasn't got the content of it. And another way of understanding that, from my perspective, is the hollowing out of popular sovereignty. You see, its ability to be sovereign over your life, economic, political, and social life. And it is precisely this that has been snuffed out. People in Europe don't feel sovereign anymore. That's why they're moving away from politics, or they are seeking answers in politics which are away from the perceived mainstream, which supports this hollowing out of democracy. It's like a game. It's like a mockery. People think that's what's happening. People think that politicians have become ineffectual mouthpieces for big business and big interests, and it doesn't really matter what ordinary people think, vote, say, because what will happen at the level of policy is what big business wants and what the politicians arrange with big business. You don't have to go very far for that. The biggest center for lobbying in the world after Washington, D.C., is Brussels. That's how policy is made. Brussels is full of lobbyists and permanent offices of big business. That is how the European Parliament works, and that is how the mechanisms of the European Union work. The lobbyists are there, they cut deals all the time, legislation is passed, it becomes part of European law, and then it gets implemented across different countries, member states, and it is often superior to constitutional law. So it doesn't matter what you vote and how you position yourself domestically through the levers of democratic power in your own country. This kind of mechanism operating in Brussels is constitutionally superior to you much of the time in terms of what policy is implemented. So it speaks for itself. There is no democracy worth talking about. This isn't the real parliament in Brussels. It's a mockery of a parliament. There isn't any real accountability. The European Central Bank makes laws all the time by deciding on policy, by issuing directives. It's actually, they have the status of law, and it gives no account to anybody. The European Court of Justice is a similar institution. It makes law, interprets law and makes law and is not accountable to anybody. So no wonder politics in Europe has deteriorated. No wonder you can't find any serious political leaders from Lisbon all the way to Moscow. I mean, no wonder that political leadership in Europe it's appalling. I mean, wherever you turn, Britain, France, Germany, Italy, if it wasn't so important, it would be a clown show. So ordinary people seek something else. They reject it. They seek something else. And they shift to the right. That's the truth of it. They shift to the right. They believe that if they vote for the mainstream, nothing will happen, and they shift to the right. Now, will they get the real answer from the right or the far right? No, not at all. Not at all. The far right will poison all desires and hopes for something different. The shift to the right, however, because amidst this deterioration, a hollowing out of democracy, the left is absent. The biggest problem for politics in Europe is the absence of the left. This is one of the weakest moments, probably the weakest moment in the history of the European left. The European left was invented 250 years ago, long before Karl Marx, was active. It was invented 250 years ago, roughly. It became real at the time of the French Revolution. What made it stand as a political tradition was its readiness to challenge the institutions of power and to say, I'm going to overturn those institutions and put different institutions in place. In other words, its readiness to challenge the status quo. Political power, and then, after Karl Marx, economic power as well. That's what made it probably the decisive political current in Europe, whether it was in power or not, because the left was very, very powerful and influential, even when it was not in political power, in government. That's no longer the case. The left is absenting itself from this kind of thing. It's not prepared to challenge the institutions of economy and society. It's not prepared to argue for different sets of institutions. It wants to tweak the system. It wants to redistribute income a little bit, deal with austerity somewhat, and so on. That's not good enough. And so what's happened is that the right has purloined some of the rhetoric of the left, dressed it up in racist and other language, and it's making hay. That's basically how I read it. And that's the significance of the Euro elections. The Euro elections, of course, will not change that much about how European policies are designed and implemented, but it matters greatly for the political evolution of Europe. The right will probably do well. That's not a good sign. That's not a good development. And in this context, it's very, very important that the loud, radical voice of the left is heard openly. That's why we are participating in the Euro election here in Greece.
Yeah, so tell us about your initiative, because it's a coalition of DM25, which is called MER25 in Greece, which is Yanis Varoufakis' project. I think he's officially the leader, isn't he? And what's called the Radical Ecological Left. So how did that coalition come to be in, and what's your kind of hopes for its future?
Cut a long story short, because it is a long story and you don't want to. Always. After Syriza in Greece, after the failure of Syriza, the Greek left has gone into a severe crisis, a loss of credibility, a loss of trust among the Greek people. Now, some of us who were in Syriza at the time refused to sign the bailout, to vote for the bailout, and walked out. but it doesn't matter. In the minds of people, we were tarred by the same brush as promising to do certain things and not delivering. So, for us, who wanted radical change and to position the left in a new way, the issue was how to regain some visibility, how to persuade people that something new is afoot. We came to the conclusion that a united front, an electoral alliance with Varoufakis and his party would be a positive way forward. Varoufakis has moved to the left. He's acknowledged that he mishandled the situation in 2015 openly. I and Varoufakis fell out at that time because he was arguing totally different things to what I was arguing. He thought that he could transform Europe and persuade Germany to do what Syriza wanted to do, while Greece remained in the Eurozone. He's acknowledged that this was the wrong thing to say and want to do, and he's moved to the left. So for us, it was a positive thing, and we agreed that we will form a united initiative and contest the Euro elections. It's a very difficult environment because, as I mentioned to you, the left has lost credibility. I think we do have a chance of getting in. If we do elect a Euro MP, we have agreed at the outset to divide the post in 3 ways. So instead of serving 60 months in Brussels and Strasbourg, which is the normal duration, we will have 3 people doing 20 months each through an informal agreement among us. We think that this is more democratic and gives more voice to people. The aim here is to act as the voice of combative opposition in the European Parliament, to force Europe to confront itself, to put the real issues of economic and other policy, militarism and so on, on the table in the European Parliament, and at the same time use that opportunity and that possibility given to us to impact on politics in Greece, to criticize domestic policies and politics in Greece, and in this way generate greater support for the left. That's the aim, and that's the hope. And I have agreed to contest the Euro election with that united initiative on this basis. But I can tell you, it's very, very difficult. It's very difficult for the left right now, and I believe it's very difficult for the left across Europe. It's just that in Greece there are particular problems because of Syriza, right? And the legacy of Syriza. But that's where we are. Optimism of the will is the key word, and we will fight and fight and fight again. And we will not give up. So we shall see what happens on the 9th of June.
Well, we wish you the best of luck with the election campaign. I'm sure many people watching, listening, will wish you the best of luck as well. Thank you, Costas, and thank you to those of you who did make it through to the end of this. So thanks to Costas again, and thank you everyone for joining us. We'll see you for the next event on the 16th of May at 7 p.m. with Tad McCormack on the militarisation of the EU. Thanks again.
Thank you, Ben. I enjoyed the talk.
Thanks.